All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am happy to see you all this afternoon. I am Patrick Hoey, the program chairman of the New York American Association for Public Opinion Research, a New York chapter. This afternoon, I am proud to offer this and introduce this IBM webinar workshop on the ins and outs of user experience research with some very experienced presenters that we hope you are happy with here. As folks continue to join the event, we will be letting them in as they arrive. Let me proceed here. First of all, NYAAPOR would like to thank its generous sponsors. Top of the list, of course, would be IBM, but also NORC at the University of Chicago. And SSRS, Research Refined. Next, GDCC, Bauman Research, Edison Research, Global Strategy Group, Queens College, MA Program in Data Analytics and Applied Social Research, Ivy Execs at our silver level. And at our bronze level and President's Council level, Marketing Systems Group, and then several individual owners. NYAAPOR is sponsoring a few upcoming events that we'd like to let everybody know about. First is next Tuesday, a roundtable discussion of election night at the major networks, featuring representatives from CBS, NBC, Fox News, ABC, CNN, and just an all-star cast. Followed later in April with our Young Public Opinion Scholars Competition. In mid-June, our Meet the Masters, an event where we get to meet some of the most prominent researchers in the field. And then concluding our 2021-2022 season, NYAAPOR Annual Awards with the presentation of the Harry O'Neill Award, again in late June. I'm going to hand it off now to Randall to introduce this afternoon's guests.
All right, great, thanks, Patrick. As I think people saw, this event was labeled as part. So we had an event on user experience, a panel discussion late last year, I believe, and that we were able to bring together some discussion based with IBM and also Google, and I think we had someone from Peloton. And following on that discussion, the question came up, can we do something to help our membership learn some of the basic methods of user research? I know there's increasing interest in that. And it was really great that since I've joined this team 2 years ago in IBM, has a lot of experienced user researchers, that we could bring something together to do this. And actually, much of the content here comes about through our own internal learning and education programs that we have to create people. So we had great content already. I'm glad that we could leverage this opportunity to share this content with many of you and introduce you to some of the great expertise that we have on our team. And Patrick, let's go ahead and oops, it looks like you muted me accidentally, Patrick. This is the schedule we'll roughly follow. So first up, we're going to look at A/B testing with Matthew Beasley. Tom Brugler was unable to join us today, but Tom also was key in developing some of this content. But you're going to hear from Matthew on A/B testing. Matthew's one of our young and up and coming user researchers and product designers at IBM. Then we're going to shift gears and go to card sorting with Jason Tellner and Mark Wise. Mark is also, you may notice now, at Dell. Mark has been at IBM and had worked there for many years, and he recently moved over to Dell to bring his expertise over there. But I'm glad he was still able to join us for this presentation and share his expertise with all of you. And then last, we will end up, but certainly not least, with Dabby Phipps. And this Dabby's presentation may be a little more in tune to what a lot of our membership is used to seeing. We have a lot of survey researchers and market researchers here, but continuous measurement and assessment and understanding your users or your customers, as the case may be, is critical, not only when you're doing UX work, but really for all of us. And Dabby will really bring that home with all of the experience she has with the various methodologies and research she's done over the years. So looking forward to a great event. If there's any questions for Patrick or myself, we'll turn it over to our first speakers.
Okay. Let me just take a moment. The rules of the road. All attendees are currently muted. Please do not unmute yourself while the presenters are speaking. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat box or hold them until the end when we will open the floor to questions directly from the audience. We will be having several breaks during the at intervals in between the presentations. And so here we go.
All right, let me pull up the presentation. Cool. Yeah, let's see. So I'll be talking, let me move Zoom's blocking my view here. Yeah, so I'll be talking through the powers and limitations of A/B testing. I'll be covering the unmoderated A/B testing that's traditionally done in marketing, and my colleague Tom was supposed to be going through the unmoderated A/B testing part, but he's on vacation. But I'll touch on it a bit later on in the presentation. So, do you really know whether each product or campaign is formatted optimally? That drives the best conversions, the best click-through rate, or are you just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best? It's hard to grow without knowing what elements of your product or campaign contributions to your efforts are they working against you? So what assumptions are we making about our products and services? So A/B testing takes a little bit of the guesswork out of it for the most part. It helps you make more confident decisions, whether it's a website or an app or even a video game. And we'll touch on that a bit. So what is A/B testing? The slide's a little scary, but let's walk through it a little bit. So A/B testing is also known as split testing. It's most famous for testing websites and landing pages, emails, and like I mentioned earlier, also video games now. So some examples include measuring purchases and subscriptions on e-commerce sites, or measuring in-game UIs, game upgrades. For example, if to see whether you're getting more purchases or clicks, testing other UIs versus current UIs and stuff like that. So fun fact, A/B testing actually predates web apps, which makes a lot of sense to me. In 1920, Ronald Fisher showed us the importance of randomized controlled studies and testing of the effects of fertilizer on plots of grass. So I found that pretty interesting and learned that recently when I first presented this. A/B testing is about testing only one element at a time so that you can maintain control over the results and draw firm conclusions. And from these conclusions, you could assess the effectiveness of each variable in driving conversions. And from there, we can make the necessary adjustments to the campaign that we're running. And by making these adjustments, we could continually improve the efforts and deliver the highest return on investment possible for our organization. But this brings up a lot of other points. Were they even interested in the content in the first place? Did they just click and leave? Did they just see a big blue shiny button and just want to click it? So what leads to these behaviors in the test? So A/B testing alone just might not be enough. So if you were ever involved in A/B testing, there's much testing lingo per se. So we have, and it can be really confusing. So for this one, we have A, which could be called a control original version 1. And for version B, it could be called a variant, a test, or version 2, or a challenger. So people refer to these things differently. So it's important just to understand that lingo when you're running A/B testing with your team. So long story short, A/B testing is a scientific method adapted for marketing. It compares 2 or more versions of assets against one another. It uses data and statistics to determine which version's better. And you implement a winner and increase conversions or whatever you want. The issue, teams and execs stop on 4 and don't continue to do other research methods and stuff like that. So that's important. What's the difference between unmoderated and moderated? My colleague was going to go into the moderated part, but I'll just give you the rundown of sort of the difference between the two. So unmoderated is more of testing 2 conditions that run simultaneously, usually a website. They're typically conducted at the end of the cycle on a live website, whether it's a link color, a button, it could be content. Some teams even do like whole website differences, but that's not recommended. And moderated test is usually hands-on experience done, like a usability test or session, usually done with the prototype. And that includes smaller sample sizes. The unmoderated test, you could test with thousands of users. But generally both provide really good insights. For moderated, you're usually giving them a task for a user to complete and having them think out loud. Sometimes even you could get some good feedback from one design and good feedback from another design, and that may even come up with a third solution that you could test with users. So both have their benefit. With unmoderated A/B tests, there's also something called multiple variant testing, which you could test several versions of a component. And if you're running a drastic test, it's best to do a multiple variant test. And this is best to do with a significant amount of traffic because you're really splitting, dispersing users across multiple versions. So you're going to decrease your significant conclusions. So that's another way of doing an A/B test and testing multiple different designs and components to see which one's providing the most conversions. So the pros and cons to A/B testing. So the pros, it's great for web testing and apps and video games and stuff like that. The sample sizes are large. You could usually get results within weeks, so it's pretty quick. It's simple setup, great for personalization if you are up for the complexity on the setup for personalization. It's cheap to launch, as long as you don't have a ton of development or extra design work needed. As far as the cons go, It's limited scope. All the results don't are along one dimension. And traditional user testing provides a lot more insights than A/B testing. Sometimes A/B testing could give you a lot of guessing of sort of why the user preferred one versus the other. And it only really works with implemented designs. So creating prototypes could be a lot more easy to update and test quick design changes quickly, where A/B testing is sort of testing with a live product. So the do's and don'ts: don't test what the gurus say to test. What works for others may not work for you. Have a hypothesis around the idea. So like by doing A and B will happen because of C, stuff like that. So have some sort of educated guess or research why the other version may be better and stuff like that. Don't test without audience and traffic, so you won't reach statistic significance or a conclusion. Yeah. And don't stop on the first result. It may be a false positive. If you implement that idea, it may tank and your team will scramble to revert to the old design. And that's just not good for your user. Don't try to test a huge update to a variation. So start with like individual components, like maybe it's a card or a button or a piece of content. Don't just update the whole page and test the whole piece of content, because you'll fail to understand what really is causing the user's decision and the results in the end. For the process, this is just a rough example, but ask yourself some questions. Why are people leaving the cart? Is their price changing once they're adding stuff into their cart and go to checkout? Does it take too long for the page to load? Is it confusing? So find your biggest opportunities, and you may just result to really good conversions. For example, you may have 7 million visits and 350,000 of them click on a cart, but only 5,000 pay, which is really bad abandonment rate, which is like 98% abandonment rate. So, you know, find some, ask yourself some questions and figure out what the goals are. So obviously from the screen on the left, there's a lot going on. So where the hell do you click next is sort of the question I would ask when someone pulled up the website for the stacks and stacks hardware place. You could start by removing some buttons and making micro adjustments and see if the conversions go up. And with the intention of trying to get to the result on the right. You have to be careful, like I said before, with dramatic changes. And users may not adapt to drastic changes early on. So it may take time for them to get used to these new designs. So it's better to ease them into the updates. And with that, you have the benefit of really determining what's really working as you make these updates. So form a hypothesis, but so you will get more out of the test if you form a hypothesis. You will get more prospects to sign up for a trial, and people will understand the value of the products and stuff like that. So one thing I wanted to show you is a tool that sort of we use at IBM when I worked in IBM marketing, which is Optimizely. So Optimizely is an A/B testing tool. You can see it's pretty easy to make changes to a website that you're working on. However, I've had times where I had to go to development and develop JavaScript and other code to get it really working right if it's a complicated change. But in general, it's really easy to work with the tools and stuff like that. If you're going to set up conversions or track clicks or visit, even bounce rate, conversion rate, stuff like that, this is where you would do it in the metrics part of the tool. So it's very easy to, pick the options you want and set that up. The next part of the tool is actually measuring. So it's very simple layout. You get some really cool graphics, and you actually get these results live as the test is running. So if you have an improvement rate, you'll have your confidence interval, and you can see your significance rate off to the right, and it'll actually alert you once your test has reached that. And you could see how many people have been hit with the experiment and how long it's been running and stuff like that. And once you reach that conclusion, you could call the test and it'll actually show you which one's the winner. So obviously the one with the most conversions would be the winner, whether it's A or B. And then your team could actually implement that. So the final real part of the process is really documenting the test. So a lot of times you could just use a spreadsheet and determine sort of what the test is, what the change in A and B were, decide what type of metric you're deciding as the winner, and then you could track sort of the winner. And this is probably the easiest way of doing rapid tests throughout the month. So there's many different A/B testing tools. I have a few listed here, like Optimizely, Adobe Target. Those are the ones that we utilized at IBM. Optimizely and Adobe Target and Google Optimizer are very similar in features. Some have more specific uses like HubSpot for email testing. Firebase A/B testing is more suitable for mobile apps. Mixpanel, we've used at IBM as well, I believe on the events team. And there's also another one, which is game analytics A/B testing, which is really for game testing, video game testing. So another fun fact, not to get political, but the CEO of Optimizely worked with the Barack Obama's campaign in 2007 to help get a greater supporter online. The team hypothesized that the video footage of Obama speaking at a rally would earn more supporters than online donations. And Dan administered a A/B test. The results were shocking to everyone, that the videos performed 30% worse than a still image of the candidate. So overall, Dan's A/B testing were responsible for 4 million email addresses out of the 13 million total and resulted in 75 million and more funding. So this is a use case where a political figure got more conversions, and it's a great example for avoiding and making assumptions. So what to test? There's so many things that you could test, pretty much anything, whether it's a call to action. I've had people come to me and want to test the content, visual media, pricing, personalization's a big one. If you use Amazon, you'll know that. Navigation, some other ones are social, testing the size of social icons and social media ads. And another big one is email testing the subject line, the body of the email, the imagery and stuff like that. For mobile apps, you could test SMS, push notifications, in-app message offers, and another big one is digital ads. So testing one ad versus the other one, and whether the paid campaigns, which one gets the most clicks and return on investment. So some of the benefits, you get real world data, so actual behavior and results. It's very inexpensive to run. And yeah, so that was pretty much it. So some of the most frequently asked questions is, should you run more than one A/B test? And some cases, yes, but it's really important to stick with maybe 2 versions because you could really bog down the website or whatever you're testing. And how much time does it take to take an A/B test? So you could be running one at least every 2 weeks, but it really depends on how much audience traffic that you get. So you could, so it really depends on the traffic and if you reach statistical significance quickly or not. So that was pretty much it for me. I'm not sure if we're going to be sharing the deck, but there's some resources that are in the deck as well. And that's all I have. And I will end the presentation.
Thank you, Matt. We are recording this event, and the presentation will be available on the New York APOR website for folks to view later at their convenience. Are there any questions? I was particularly interested in the Barack Obama example. That was something, and to me, the takeaway is, his website does fine. The candidate's website was doing just fine as long as the candidate didn't really appear in it very often. So I thought that was an interesting conclusion. Whatever it is, the much vaunted Obama's social media machine did very well, of course. But I thought that was an interesting conclusion from the A/B testing. I'd rather have a video of the candidate, a still image.
Yeah.
Are there other questions, folks? Yes. What is generally a sample size ballpark for an unmoderated A/B testing?
That's a great question. With IBM, we really didn't have many issues because we had millions of visits. But yeah, I'm not really sure sort of the ballpark. I would say like at least 1,000 or so. You could really get a lot of results from that, but it may take a little bit longer. The lower you go, the longer it takes to actually get a firm conclusion. So I would say like at least 1,000 or more.
Does that help, Payel? Oh, got it. Thanks. All right. More questions. Of course, if you have questions and you want to ask, hold them until the end of the event, that's just fine, but there's no time like the present. All right, then, let's move on to Mark Weiss.
All right, thank you, Patrick. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right, hopefully you all can see my screen. So this afternoon, Jason Tellner and I will be just talking about card sorting. and what that's used for. So we'll be talking about the sort of the underpinnings of card sorting, the applications of that type of research, some best practices around conducting it, and then the actual mechanics of how to set it up, how to do the analysis, and how to apply the results of that analysis to your particular project. So sorry, a little quote, a good system shortens the road to the goal. And I think when we think about card sorts and using them to help define the navigation and the organization of content within a website or application, a good information architecture helps the user to get where they're going as quickly as they can, or it improves the findability of the content and helps guide the user to where they're ultimately trying to go. So by having a well-defined, well-organized set of content, we can shorten the road for the user to get to their individual goal. Card sorting, which we'll be talking about, is a research method, and it's used to help define, design, or evaluate the information architecture of a site. So we can use it sort of, throughout the process early on to understand how things should be organized, the actual application of that organization, and then also to evaluate post hoc, the navigation or content structures that are in place. Information architecture, if you're not familiar, refers to the organization labeling of content to help users find information, understand where they are. So if you think about navigating through a very deep, complex website, sort of knowing where you are in that site and what's around you, right? Where are the options for you to go, to navigate to try to ultimately get to your end goal. So just high level items. So card sort, what is it good for? It's, we mentioned, used to define the organization of content. You can use it to define menus within an application, to help define navigation in a website or application, can group similar pieces of content. So maybe it's not across multiple pages or multiple screens, but on an individual page or individual screen, if you want to find out the best clustering or grouping of content within that screen to match the user's mental model, you can use a card sort for this as well. And then also, as we said, for developing a larger, wider site architecture. When to use it. So typically card sorts are activities that are performed early on in the design process. So when you're initially thinking about the content and information that you have, it's a good time to start to try to figure out the best way to organize that content in a way that's meaningful to the user. So that when you start to build out the actual screens and the actual navigation, you have that information as a foundation to build on. How's it conducted? Well, a card sort traditionally involves a set of cards. So they might be index cards with words or topics written on them. And the participant in the study groups these cards into categories that make logical sense to them. So in a very traditional sense, you'd have a list of index cards with a bunch of words. You're going to create little stacks or piles of words that you think are somehow related to one another, according to whatever heuristic or whatever characteristics make sense to you as the user or the participant in the study. And then you apply this to across multiple participants. You take the results from all those, sort of collate them together statistically, that Jason will get much more into that, to sort of define the categories that make the most sense to the most people. And then what do you need to do it? Well, a lot of web-based tools, survey tools have some card sorting capabilities built into them. Alchemer, for example, UserZoom, both fairly common survey tools, can be used to create a card sorting task and then also to analyze the data, although they can do it in different ways. And then, as I mentioned, you can do it old school way with actual physical index cards and have people conduct or participate in the activity that way. So what are some of the underpinnings of card sorts? Well, why is it something that works? Why is it something we need to do? Well, as humans, we sort of naturally want to categorize information. We want to put it in ways that we can organize things, we can organize objects, ideas, in a way that we find some thread that connects them through some characteristic, whatever the main item might be that sort of combines them or brings them together for you. It helps us to simplify our understanding of the world. It helps us to more quickly retrieve information from our memory and more accurately as well. And you can see the hippocampus. We actually have a part of our brain that is not say dedicated, but is mostly concerned with helping us to organize memories. And this idea of organizing content and information goes back, I'm sure it predates Aristotle, but we see Aristotle as one of the first examples of someone that's trying to classify information. And he was doing that by classifying animals in his Historia Animalium. Should have taken Latin. And that's the history of animals. So he was looking to group creatures, animals, according to similarities that he saw. You can see that he broke them down very broadly, those with red blood cells, those with, vertebrates, invertebrates, with or without red blood cells, and within the vertebrates, whales, fish, birds, so land mammals, reptiles, and then other invertebrates as well. Sort of, if you've taken an intro to psych class, you probably at one point talked about George Miller and his magical number 7, where during his research looking at limitations in human information processing, he found that in general, most adults can store and retrieve between 5 and 9 items in their working memory, so our short-term memory, as you would think about it. So came up with his 7 plus or minus 2. You'll see it was referenced in his seminal article on that. And so it wasn't just that we can remember 9 pieces of information, like 9 words or 9 letters or 9 numbers, but we can remember additional items if they're logically chunked together or formed into categories. So it's not just 7 plus or minus 2 items, but it's 7 plus or minus 2 categories or chunks of information that we tend to be able to work with and store in our working memory. Now, later on in '66, Cohen was looking at some research on memory and asking people to study a list of words and then recall them back. And what he found was that without any prompting, people would detect different categories or commonalities between the words. They would store the words based on those categories in their memory. And then when they were retrieving the information, they would use this coded information, this categorical information to bring it back and remember it. Oops. So if we're looking here, like a list of words that you might have used: train, bus, glider, car, canoe, tank, helicopter, sailboat. He found that the participants would sort of naturally group them into categories, right? So you might have air vehicles, land vehicles, water vehicles, and then upon recall, they would refer back to these major categories and maybe remember, oh, there were 4 air vehicles when they're trying to recall. Maybe there are 5 land vehicles when they're trying to recall, right? So they can use those then to recall the words without having to remember verbatim all, whatever that is, 10 or so, but they could remember the categories and the groupings. And the application goes beyond that. So it's just, we assume that humans naturally want to and do categorize information that they bring in. And so you can also sort of reverse that and test the neuropsychological ability by asking people to perform tests that use the categorization types of processes. So in the Wisconsin card sorting test, you have participants and they're presented with some stimulus cards, and then they're told to match the cards, but they're not told initially what characteristic to match them on. So for example, if the 3 yellow triangles are the card that you're presented and you're asked to match it to one of those other 4 cards, a participant may first match it to the 2 red triangles because it's matching triangles to triangles. They're not told that which one to match on. They're just told that in that case, maybe it's wrong. So maybe they go to the next one, they say, okay, well, this is yellow and the star is yellow, I'll match that. And the test administrator said, well, that's not correct either. And then lastly, they'll say, well, there's no match, doesn't appear to be between these 4 blue diamonds, but there are 3 items in both this green circles and the yellow triangles. So I'll match on that. And then maybe that was the correct one. So the participants aren't told which match is right or wrong. They're just given feedback. It is wrong. It tests the abstract reasoning and ability for people to change their problem solving strategies. Right? So it makes them think about different types of categorizations and groupings. Likewise, California Verbal Learning Test has people again try to remember a list of 16 words, and the words are belonging to 4 different semantic categories. They're tools, they're fruits, they're clothing, they're spices and herbs. So the words are originally created, so they fall into one of these 4 categories, and the idea is to see if people will categorize them. And people with more advanced abstract reasoning will, again, sort of automatically categorize the words to create memory mnemonics to allow themselves to remember them. And one last study, the Loesch et al. In 1999 had people categorize a bunch of different graphical images. So these are some examples of the images that they used. And there was a number of findings. One of the interesting ones for here anyway, is that they found that there was a difference in how graphic artists and the other participants grouped the images. So the graphic artists were grouping them more along the lines of graphical design elements and styles, and the other participants were organizing them along other dimensions, maybe like biology, right, or charts and maps or something. But it tells us that even with the same set of stimuli, not everyone is going to create the same sets of categories, right? Especially if you're talking about different user groups, maybe are coming at the problem or coming at the information with a different perspective. So it sort of underscores the need for this, and basically for any sort of usability testing or user testing, that we need to have a representative sample of our end users, right? We can't do a card sort with one group of people, find out the categorization of content for them, and then think it's going to also apply to a different group of people that may have a different set of perspectives or knowledge of the topic. So after all that, how do we apply card sorting in UX or user experience? We talked about card sorting as something that we perform to help us identify and build out information architecture. So we can use it to define and design information architecture, to create workflows, to define menu structures, navigation aids, navigation paths for a website. It's often used for sites or applications have a variety of different content and features. So multitude of different things. We look over here. It's an example or a screenshot of Amazon's top level navigation, right? So all of these items were clustered into a way that they thought was going to be meaningful to the user. And there's certainly a variety of content here. So figuring out the best ways to organize them helps the user to then ultimately find achieve their goals. Information architecture helps figure out how items should be organized, again, so it makes most sense to the target audience. And lastly, if there's already an existing taxonomy that exists for something, so like in biology or the Dewey Decimal System in the library sciences, it makes sense to use that existing taxonomy if the content that you're working with belongs there, rather than come up with your own through a card sort. So if there's an existing taxonomy that already exists, then it usually makes sense to apply that rather than come up with something new. So when should you use a card sort? Well, if you have no existing taxonomy available that you should use, then it makes sense to create one. If the items that you have are too large or too diverse to fit into smaller or more conventional categories, you need to think of maybe more abstract categories, especially if you're dealing with more abstract types of topics. If the items are very similar to one another and it's difficult to figure out, where to create that dividing line for the different categories, then makes sense to use a card sort. You get user input and participation. And like I said, if the groups themselves differ in how they are, would view and group the items. So you want to make sure that the card sort and research you're conducting is with representative end users. But then, also perhaps if you have different types of user groups that are using a single application, you could even consider maybe changing or modifying the organization of the navigation and the site structure to match the different perspectives and groupings of the different user groups. So how do you conduct a card sort? This is the sort of overall way to do it. So for an open card sort, you have participants and they sort their cards into categories that make sense to them. So you have a user and they get a bunch of randomized cards with terms. Sometimes they have definitions. If it's something more abstract, then you might want to include a definition or something you're not familiar with. Otherwise, you can just use a word or phrase if that's something that would be familiar to the participants. Here we have a bunch of foods that are listed. And then the participant will go ahead and just group those cards into categories that are logical and meaningful to them. Right, so here we have 4 different groups of things, and then the participant's going to label the categories. So they're going to put them into the groups that make sense to them, and then usually provide some sort of label that they think best represents these. So we have fruits, we have vegetables, miscellaneous, it doesn't fit anywhere in these 2, and then foods Mark doesn't like in the 4th category. You repeat this process multiple times across multiple participants. Again, so you can get sort of a larger sample size, and then you analyze those results to find any patterns that emerge in the categorization. So we talked about an open card sort just then, which the participants create their own labels based on the categories they create. This is generally used sort of early on to create ideas or general heuristics for organizing content. And also we know that you could have an open number of buckets or fixed. So here there's 4. So the person would put them into 4 buckets. And so you can define and say there's only going to be this many items. So for example, if you have a website navigation, you can only fit 5 top level items, then maybe you're going to try to limit your participants to 5 categories. Or you could just have an unlimited number where you could say, create as many buckets as you want, as long as they make sense to you. So it'd be something that as a researcher, you'd probably want to decide a priori before you start the research. The second one is a closed card sort, where you already have the names established. So if you have a menu structure or navigation structure that's already been established, maybe you want to find out where to put new items into it. You might use a closed card sort, or card sort can be used to verify and validate some organizations that may be found on the initial open card sort. So in this case, we're starting with predefined category names. Then you ask the participants to assign the cards to the categories that you've already defined, and you see where they end up there. So again, it reveals extent of agreement, which cards belong under each category. And many times it's used to verify or validate categories and structures that have been maybe previously defined, or maybe items that you got from an open card sort, or lastly, as I mentioned, taking new items and seeing where they fit into an existing taxonomy. Just quickly in the results, there's ways to define the commonalities, the clusters between the different cards that the participants are using. Simplest way is a frequency table, where you're just looking at the frequency with which 2 items are correlated with one another or combined with one another. For example, the survey tool Alchemer shows something like this, where it just shows the percentage of commonality. More advanced is a dendrogram, which would be something like UserZoom uses those, and it creates the sort of visualization that shows the clustering of cards. And in most cases, Certainly within user Zoom, you can sort of adjust the strength of the relationship that you're looking for. So you can see where this dotted vertical line is. If we decide to slice our navigation there, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories. If you want to move that thing further to the right, you end up with 2 categories. You can move that thing further to the left, you end up with more categories. So just depending on the strength of the relationships you want to see between your groups, you can sort of adjust that slider. Some quick best practices: limit the number of cards. Try not to have more than 30 to 50 items, especially if it's an open card sort, or you may want to think about splitting across multiple activities. So if you have 100 items, maybe you're going to do 50 and 50 across 2 different sets of participants. It's good to randomize a presentation so that people have, or each piece of content has an equal chance of being one of the first items out there. Certainly some of the first items you're going to put out there probably have a lot of weight in determining what your future categories are going to be. So by randomizing the presentation of those, getting different words, different items towards the front, can make sure that we're getting a good representative categorization. And as we mentioned, open card sort, when they can create their own categories. Closed card sort, where the categories are already created. Generally you can use an open card sort to figure out what goes together initially, and the closed card sort allows you to validate and test those labels to see if they make sense. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Jason, I talked about sort of traditional card sort types of activities, but just categorizing and grouping data doesn't have to be limited to simple card sorts. So several years ago, I was working with my wonderful manager, Del Lauren, on the IBM Internet homepage. And we had a number of different pieces of content. We wanted to figure out where they belonged, where they should belong on the page. So we created like little cards and had a piece of paper and put them in front of people. And we asked them to take these little portlets. So they might be HR, content, news, search, docs, links. And we said, put them where you would want to see them on your homepage. And so we could use that to sort of define the basic, default homepage layout for people. And so they went ahead, participants, moved those items to where they would want to see it on the page. And then we ended up sort of calculating the average position of each of the items, and then using that to define what the final default homepage would be when the application was deployed. So that is what I have, sort of the background and basics. And I'm going to turn it over to Jason, who's going to go over the mechanics of setting one up and analyzing the data. So I'm going to stop and Jason will start.
Thanks, Mark.
Mark,
For the transition.
if you don't mind, can I interrupt a moment?
Sure.
I have a question here. I've done some card sorting on CSAT dashboard design. That I went to some conferences where we engaged in CSAT website design exercises, and those were very helpful. Now I'm with an organization that's doing a total website design. With the hundreds and or thousands of products, and multifaceted, complicated service and sales organization. How difficult is it to do a total website design that may involve altering the existing design, and just building up some sort of fighting this, maybe fighting, I don't know if I'm describing this right, but succumbing institutional sort of resistance to change. To me, it's more difficult to achieve than is imagined. Is that common?
Jason may be better to answer this than I, but
Okay.
I think that's more of a, like you said, sort of institutional thing to overcome rather than, sort of the card sort. No, I mean, I think in dealing with huge numbers of items that could be in the card sort, like you described, I think there are ways to address that. So you could, just pick like a random sample of items and assume that, the categories would then work for the other things, or as I mentioned, break it up into multiple card sorts where you might, show 50 random 50 items to one, group of people, then a separate random 50, and then, so on. And then you
Yeah,
sort of combine all
the major
those.
issue is overloading respondents with how many items they have to sort. So there's a general rule of thumb. I mean, not that it can be done, it's just going to be a lot of workload.
Thank you, Mark. Jason,
Yeah,
sorry to
so
interrupt. Thank you
no
very
problem.
much.
You're welcome. So I'm going to talk about some of the tools for card sorting that we have. I'm going to quickly give an overview of when different card sorts can be used and some of the advantages and disadvantages of the tools, and then finally just get into some of the results. And I'm going to focus on one specific tool that I have experience using, which is UserZoom. I've also used Alchemer, which you can do card sorting as well. It's a bit more rudimentary, so I'm not going to jump into those screen grabs for how to set up a card sort, and also just the time limitations. I'm going to focus on UserZoom. So just to review the different types of card sorts and when to use them. So you typically start a card sort with an open sort, and this is generally used at the beginning when categories have not been established for items, or you simply want to validate category names for items. And then this is generally followed by a closed card sort where you test the categories that were created from your open sort. They also have
Jason,
a high. Yep.
Jason, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, am I not? I'm sorry. Jeez, how did that not? It didn't engage. Okay, there we go. Okay, so just to review, I'm going to just get into the different types of card sorts. So we have an open sort, which is generally what's used at the start of a card sort study. So this is when categories have not been established yet for items, or you want to validate category names for items. And then this is usually followed by a closed card sort, which is essentially testing the categories that were created from the open card sort. So in terms of the open sort, you generally want to, it's recommended you want to test 30 to 50 items, depending on how complex the sort is, as well as the domain knowledge of your users. You generally don't want to overload participants, as I was saying before, so you don't want to have them in a session for longer than 30 minutes or so. And then importantly, the cards that you're testing, or the items, should be on the same conceptual level. So for example, if you're testing, say, like different types of chairs, you wouldn't want to have something like furniture in that, because that's like a higher level category. They're not on the same conceptual level. And then in terms of the recommended number of categories for an open sort that participants create, there's no limits. You generally don't want to limit them, because this is where you want them to kind of just have freedom to create as many categories as you want. Typically, number of respondents, you want to have at least 40 in order to get sufficient data to look at your results. And then the open sort is typically followed by the closed sort. And this is when you already have established category names from your open sort, and you want to test how well the items you have fit into those categories. So you can do this with the same set of respondents, or you can also use a different set of respondents. Typically, you want to have 30 to 50 items, although having more than 50 can be okay if the card sort is fairly simple. Once again, the cards should be on the same conceptual level and be similar enough for participants to sort them into these groups. Recommended number of categories, it depends on the research, but I wouldn't use more than like 20 different categories. It just gets pretty complicated if you have more of those. And then you kind of get the one-offs where people are just kind of putting one item into a category. It just makes your results kind of messy. And typically also you want to have a minimum of 40 respondents do this just to have sufficient data. Okay, so there are a lot of different tools you can use to do card sorting, and I specifically looked at 2 of them, but there certainly are other ones that you can do this with. So the ones I looked at were Alchemer and UserZoom. So I'll start off with Alchemer, and this is a great tool for doing all types of surveys. The card sort feature in this, however, is a bit more rudimentary, and it requires more manual work on the part of the researcher. It is useful, though, for open sorts if you expect to have more than 12 categories, because some software like UserZoom actually limits the number of open categories that a participant can create. However, there are some display issues that are kind of irritating with this one, where, for example, items and categories as participants go through the task are going off the page. So it's not a great experience for the participant. So that's why I wouldn't really recommend this one. I mean, if it's all you have, that's, probably okay, but it's certainly not Alchemer's specialty. And also you have to have a very good understanding of stats and data in order to do the analysis, because all it's really giving you is a frequency table. It doesn't give you the dendrograms, and you have to actually do that by brute force and put it together. So you have to have a good understanding of how cluster analysis works to create your dendrograms. I did that myself, and it was a fair bit of work. So UserZoom is great in that respect, in that it automatically spits out the dendrograms, and it really just the interpretation and the insights from it. The researcher doesn't have to put it together. In terms of the setup for Alchemer, you can do both open and close sorts. You can customize the font size and style. You have to manually enter in most of the information, like the descriptions for the items. And then in terms of any post-test questions, the researcher has to do all that. So there's nothing really built in or automated. The nice thing about it, though, is it is unlimited for both open and closed card sorts in terms of the number of categories. You can customize the number of columns. There are layout limitations, like I was saying before, where things go off the page. So if you have a large number of items, it's not ideal. And then it's also fairly limited in terms of the analysis and reporting of data. So it only gives you the frequency table, no dendrograms. You got to export it to SPSS, and you got to understand how to do the cluster analysis and put you basically have to pull your dendrogram from, entering your data in SPSS and creating the right type of dendrogram and using cluster analysis and doing the right type of clustering. So then we get into UserZoom, which I personally feel is just a much better tool. It does have, the only real limitation I found for UserZoom was that you are limited in terms of the open number of categories. So it's a max of 12 for some reason for open sorts, but no limit for closed sorts. So it's a great tool. If you are really fixated on that max of 12 for open sort and you want it to just be completely unlimited, then I would suggest investigating a different tool. And there are other tools out there. There is actually one tool that is specifically only for sorting type things called Tree Test, which I would recommend. So UserZoom is great for all types of surveys. The card sort fear is more advanced and automated. It's great for closed sorts with a large number of items. You don't get any of those display issues, so everything is displayed really nicely for your participants. It is a fair bit easier to use than Alchemer, and you don't really need any stats knowledge in terms of putting the dendrogram together. In terms of understanding of cluster analysis, you just have to be able to interpret how the dendrogram is shown. And that's really not too hard. You don't have to have, a very deep knowledge of stats to be able to pull out the insights. So it's good for open and closed sorts. It's easy to set up. The fields for item descriptions it's all automated, and the post sort questions, it actually has those already pre-programmed in. So the researcher doesn't have to create new questions, but they can if they want. You cannot specify the number of columns in a sort task. So that's not really such a limitation because it kind of lays it out well for you anyways. There aren't any layout limitations. The scrolling is fine. There's no irritating page display issues. It gives you the dendrograms, a participant summary, the card and category frequency. So it gives you that percentage of respondents who classified items under each category. You could also export it to Excel and SPSS if you did want to do more statistical manipulations on it. So the results are great. It gives you a lot of graphs and a lot of important insights. So it's a great tool for that. And I'm going to get into UserZoom a bit more for card sorting, just to kind of walk through how you would set up a study with UserZoom. So you would first create a new project. You would then choose an unmoderated test. So UserZoom, you could do both moderated and unmoderated usability testing, but this is an unmoderated experience. You would then choose card sort, and you would choose both the desktop and tablet option. You want to give your project a name and give it a description. And then you can invite your own participants or specify the number, and you would get a survey link that you could send out to all your respondents to take the card sort. So essentially you set up the welcome page, they have legal consent, so that it creates all that for you. And you can enter in any other survey questions like demographics or any other background information you want to get. You enter in the task description, so it pretty much just already has that inserted in terms of what the task description is for a card sort. You want to choose the open sort option. Choose range of categories. The max is 12. So that's really, the main limitation here. And it's best to order the categories, order the items randomly. You don't want to have any order effects of the presentation. So here you can insert all the different items that you want your respondents to sort, and then you click create. You can also add in descriptions and images for these items, which is really nice. So it's really easy to type in a description. You can upload an image for whatever that represents. So I actually use this for a study on our workplace or employee website, where they had to categorize a whole bunch of different items from all sorts of different types of items and information. So things to do with support or different types of software. So it's like basically an HR website where they had to determine where things would fit into categories. So essentially it was for creating the information architecture and the categorization of a site. So this is actually what it looks like once it's set up. So you get a welcome page, and this is all done for you. So the instructions are there, answer some demographic questions, complete a task that involves grouping items into categories, and then answer follow-up questions related to your experience. The study should take about 20 minutes. There's the privacy disclaimer, and then we get into the survey. So it starts off with, whatever background questions you want. Okay, so then we have the instructions to organize the topic cards into groups that make sense to you. So you can read more description about each topic card by hovering over the little eye. So it gives a nice little description. You want to name each group. So this is for an open sort once again. So here they're creating the categories that the items are going into. So they're going to name those categories. So you want them to name the group you feel that accurately describes the content. They can create as many or as few groups as they want. There is no wrong answer. Actually, this is not entirely accurate. There is a limitation of 12 open groups, so it's not actually unlimited. Remember, you can always move an item from one category to another. You create it by dragging and dropping. And then the session gets recorded as well. So that's nice. There's a video recording of each participant doing the task. So these instructions are very detailed and clear for the participant. And then once again, it gives them just a very short instruction to please start reading each of the items on the left, and then sort the items into meaningful groups by dragging them from the left and dropping them on the right. And this is what it actually looks like when it's set up. So here we can see we have 23 items. And this is from a research study we did on our HR website, looking at how all these different applications fit into a variety of categories. So some of these applications are, for example, for storage or for email or for collaboration type tools, or things like Photoshop for creating graphic design. So essentially they just drag them to the right. They got the little eye icon. So if they don't know what Red Hat is, you can click on it and it gives you a nice little description of what type of software Red Hat is. And then they basically drag it to the right, and then it says insert category name to create the category name. So they're free to put as many, as many items into a category as they want, or as few items into a category as they want. Okay. So here, this is actually now, so I finished the open sort. So now I'm going to talk about the closed sort. So it's a very similar setup to the open sort. You select the closed categories. It's best to randomize the order of the items once again. And then you start by adding in the category name. So this is what you would have, gotten done all the analysis on your open sort, and then you would have arrived at your category names, and you got all the same items. So you're going to put in your category names for your closed sort. And they're going to be sorting the items into those categories. So once again, you add in the category names and the item names. So the category names you have. You add in descriptions of the categories and of the items, and you can also add in images for the items, just as you did in the open sort. So once again, it gives you some very nice instructions that are very clear. Organize the topic topics in the groups provided. You can read more description by hovering over the eye. Remember, you can always move an item from one category to another. Okay, so the session is recorded. Please start by reading each item on the left. Sort the items into meaningful groups. So here you can see that the group names were already created by the researcher, and the task is simply to drag the items so that they fit a group. There's no sort of other, we kind of force respondents to put all the items into a group. And then there's also some follow-up questions after. Typically, we want to avoid having like an other or I don't know, because we want to be able to get enough data in each of the categories. And then we also have, what's nice about this is it gives some follow-up questions about their understanding and difficulty in doing those tasks. So for example, how difficult did you find the sort? So we want to get a difficulty rating, if anything was frustrating or difficult. Were any of the items unclear or difficult to sort? So if they say yes, we want them to select all the ones that they felt were, unclear or difficult. So maybe they still didn't know what an item is, or they didn't feel it really fit any of the categories. So that's really important information that the researcher wants to know. And then we ask a why, a follow-up as to the reason why anything was unclear or difficult. And then also importantly, we want to ask, were there any items that you wanted to place in more than one category? So if they say yes, we want them to select. So that's important because we want to be able to tell if some of these items could actually fit into multiple categories, which could be an issue for our information architecture or whatever we're categorizing, because then you can have, ambiguity amongst people who are using it in terms of this could be in here or it could also be in here. It could create findability issues. And now we get into the results. So this is the dendrogram that UserZoom will provide. So the scale on the top is the agreement scale. So it shows the percentage of agreement between the items. So you can see that as the agreement level is higher, as more of these items are clustering together, the items, the higher the percentage that they will form the same cluster. And as there's less agreement between them, there'll be more clusters. So it's less likely that they're going to form the same cluster. And the researcher can actually adjust this threshold, and that will affect how many different categories that you get. There's generally a rule of thumb that you generally want it to be like around 20 to 30%. You generally don't want to play with that and move it anymore. So that's a nice customization feature that's in here, and it actually shows you how the groups change based on the shading in terms of moving that back and forth or higher or lower. So you can see here that I was able to form some rough categories just on looking at this. You can see that, the top 3 tools are related to client sales and marketing. And then we have, sorry, I'm having an issue here. Oh, there we go. Everything kind of went back. But and then we have other tools that are for data analytics so we can kind of see patterns from this, and other ones that are related to cloud, collaboration and teaming, file storing and sharing, and the role of developer. So what's nice with this adjustment is you can kind of see how these clusters are forming naturally. And, you also kind of have to use, the researcher has to use their domain knowledge, because they'll know if 2 things are clustering together that, are really unrelated, that there's probably something strange going on here, or maybe you don't have your threshold set appropriately. So that shouldn't really be happening. And then we have design tools and things to do with management. The other piece of result that it gives you is this similarity matrix, which Mark was talking about before. So it actually gives you the percentage of correlation or clustering between the items. So you can see wherever it's a dark blue, it's showing that there's more of a chance that those 2 items are in the same cluster. So for example, we have Box.IBM and Box Notes. So that's like pretty high. Those are, would go in the, most likely go in the same category than things that are a lot lower. With, for example, Box.IBM, we got some that are like, well, there's one that's even like, 15% with capital request is lower, Byte.IBM 6%. So those are unlikely to be in the same category. And that is everything I have for now. It might be a good time now for Mark and I to take some questions. I know there's quite a bit of information here, but if anyone was unclear on how these tools work or how the results work or anything else about the methodologies, we'd be happy to answer questions.
Oh, we do have a question from Deb. Deb, do you want to ask it yourself or?
Sure. So in the example tools that you had, I'm just curious, like, in addition to like the Uber overall questions, like, how easy, difficult was this task and so forth, can you do individual questions for each card? So for instance, like one example, maybe there's a lot of cards, but then the business needs to prioritize features, functionality. So maybe you can tap in further with your participants on, maybe how valuable this feature is to them, how often are they going to use this feature, and so forth, to help, let's say, guide your PDMs and engineers on, hey, we should focus on these features first.
Yeah, I mean, you can always create custom questions at the end if you'd want to ask about a specific item in terms of priority, or any other question you have about, how it was categorized. The researchers at liberty to put in custom questions at the end. Those are just the kind of set
Okay.
ones that Alchemer, has set up, but you're always free to put in additional questions.
Okay. Yeah, because one time I did a card sort, and it was like super old school, paper, pencil, and actually had participants after the card sort rate them in terms of like, is this an advanced feature or a basic feature? And that helped kind of steer the direction of that whole 80-20 rule. Because, in a lot of applications, there could be tons and tons of features, but we really only use like 10 or 20% of the features. And so this helped guide us on prioritizing the features and functionalities of this application.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I wonder, Deb, if that would be maybe, you would do the card sort initially, figure out the categories, and ask people to look within those categories then, and like, rank
Yeah,
order them or something.
Yeah, with each card. So what I ended up doing in this study, like I said, super old school. So after they did the card sort, because we don't want to mess up that methodology, it's like, okay, can't move your cards or anything, but then I would have them flip them over, and then with a pen, they would answer questions about each item on the card. Like, again, is this a basic feature or an advanced feature? Very high level. Or how valuable or how likely would you actually use this feature? And using that extra data help guide us to further simplify the interface where, okay, not only prioritize 80-20 rule, but really focus on that 20% and spend most of our time there to get that UX right. And then, there's the advanced settings, and then we can give that attention later. So again, it was just kind of a business priority. So
Yeah,
I'm
that
just
makes a lot
curious
of
if those
sense.
tools allow stuff like that.
I don't think they allowed on the individual card level. Like when
Okay.
the people are moving the cards, I think Jason said you could, like, after they do the card sort, then show them all of the items and ask them to rate them or something on importance or frequency. Or
Yeah, I mean,
whatever
you
it
can
might
put in another task at the end if you want.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
be. Thanks, Deb.
Hey, we did have one question we did not, that I didn't get to. It's addressed to Matt. And it's from Greg over at Google. You use A/B tests almost exclusively with behavioral data, or do you also use surveys sometimes?
It depends on what you're A/B testing. Sometimes if it's a simple component, we may not require additional testing, but in general, I don't recommend stopping at A/B testing alone because you can't fully understand what the user's reasons for their behavior is. You could risk the false positives in the A/B test. So it's important to pair the A/B test with other studies like usability tests, surveys, and so on. It's A/B tests are good for getting quick numbers on a design with a large sample. And then it's important to validate those with other research methods.
Okay. Greg, that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I also wanted to possibly follow up just quickly about, we do a bunch of A/B tests here at Google too, and I often find we get into these debates about like which of the numbers or metrics, like the metrics don't all go in the same direction, right? Some of them go up, some of them go down, some of them don't move at all, and you've got this like basket of metrics that you're following, and sometimes the A/B test isn't so clear as to like, well, was that good or bad, that change, I'm just sort of wondering like how you deal with that. Like, do you prioritize certain metrics over others, or do you try to take sort of this gestalt sort of like view over a large number of metrics to see whether it's good or not?
We ran into this issue too with the A/B testing when I worked on the .com side of things, and it's always a debate. But we focused on engagement rate and conversions, more so engagement rate, but it had to be like totally dramatic as far as a difference in um, the metrics in order to implement the design, because we would have a lot of people that would be standoff to implementing a design with if they were very similar in results. So I guess when that happened, we definitely had to implement the other research methods to really figure out the reasons behind those. Not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question because it's sort of like, well, sometimes it's not so clear, like with all those metrics, like what to do. And I guess that's a
Yeah.
good advice. Then try and triangulate with other methods to try to get more signal on what you should do.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to take a short break. And so, 5 to 10 minutes, we'll be back at 1:30.
All right, thanks, Patrick.
All right, welcome back. Before we proceed, are there any other questions for the panelists, presenters thus far? Once again, feel free to type them into the chat box, or wait until we open the floor for questions from the audience and ask your question at that time. All right, without further ado, yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Dabby. And you are muted.
Sorry about that. I'm using two screens and was trying to get my pointer back over.
Okay.
So
All yours.
share screen here. All right. So thank you everybody for joining today. My talk this afternoon is going to be on measuring user sentiment with evidence-based best practices. A little bit about me. I have a master's from Georgia Tech in engineering psychology. I've worked for over 20 years in various aspects of UX, including research, interaction design, conversation design, content design. Currently at IBM, I'm the program owner for the Voice of the Employee program, which tracks user sentiment for over 500 internally used applications. I live with 3 cats in upstate New York and enjoy things like board games, video games, D&D, kayaking, hiking, and reading. So basically, I'm a nerdy outdoor person. So then, why am I talking today about measuring user sentiment? Why is it even important? As you can see from Bezos' quote, our world continues to grow ever more interconnected, where individual users can be influencers to hundreds, thousands, or even more people. Users want to feel heard and they want action taken on their input. And gosh darn it, if they don't get it, they're going to tell everybody about it. We'll be looking at 4 different metrics for measuring user sentiment. Actually, it's almost like 6 because there's 2 flavors of satisfaction, both customer satisfaction, CSAT, and overall satisfaction, OSAT. Net Promoter Score, the System Usability Scale, or SUS, and the usability metric for user experience, UMUX, and then a variation called UMUX Lite. So today we're going to cover the what, the when, the how, the pros and cons. We'll look at research on each of these and the reliability and validity, because we want to be confident in the metrics that we gather and report, especially when we want to use them to compare applications or to track the quality of the user experience. We'll also look at best practices to give you confidence when you actually use one of these metrics. So I'll start off today looking at customer satisfaction and overall satisfaction. But first, what do we even mean by satisfaction? So let's get everybody on the same page. According to the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, satisfaction is the customer's perception of the degree to which the customer's requirements have been fulfilled. So satisfaction is all about perception. So why might we want to measure satisfaction? First off, we want to know how happy our customers are with our products and services. And why is that? Because happy customers buy stuff. They become repeat customers and they influence others to become future customers through word of mouth, social media, comments, ratings, etc. Personally, I know I always look for feedback and ratings before buying products, even if I don't know the person providing it, and I'm leery about buying products that haven't been reviewed yet. So while this is not a solely altruistic endeavor, since it is ultimately about making money, but we're not really trying to influence users to give us reviews we don't deserve. Rather, we want to take the information that we get back to better inform our products and services. Customers are going to buy stuff, so you might as well make the stuff your company creates something they want to buy. Personally, I work in an organization that is focused on internal applications used by employees at IBM. We try to determine how happy our employees are with their working experience, which can depend on many factors, including their experience with the tools we provide and that they have to use throughout the course of each and every day of their work. Happy employees want to stay at the company. They assist with recruiting, and they're even more productive than unhappy. Happy, productive employees make good products efficiently, and they waste less time. And as we all know, time is money. Which brings us back to gathering user satisfaction. So what are the differences between CSAT, or customer satisfaction, and OSAT, overall satisfaction? First, the audience or user population. Customer satisfaction is about surveying our customers. It's right in the name of it. Whereas in IBM CIO, we tend to call it overall satisfaction, or sometimes just satisfaction for short, because our focus is on our employees rather than customers. Second, it can be defined by the scope of what we want to assess user sentiment for. Is it a specific aspect of the experience, such as support, usability, value, or is it about the overall satisfaction with a product or service? And third, we'll look at how the data is analyzed. What's the intended use of the results? A lot of companies survey customers with the ultimate intent of portraying the result back to their customers as either a competitive benchmark or perhaps a marketing plea. I'm sure we've all seen those commercials where 4 out of 5 dentists recommend some toothbrush, toothpaste, mouthwash, whatever. Whereas for overall satisfaction, we want to look at the portion of users who said they were either satisfied or very satisfied on a 5-point scale, and then come up with a number from that, so that we can actually then measure across time how our application is doing or compare that satisfaction between applications. There are many ways and settings in which CSAT and OSAT measures can be gathered, and there are implications for each of those. I'm sure all of us at one point or another have been asked to take a survey or questionnaire, either after purchasing something or perhaps eating at a restaurant or getting online technical support. The key is to administer the survey or questionnaire in a timely fashion in order to get user input near the context of the interaction. So right there in that context of when the users had the experience and it's fresh and they can give you a response on it. Because as time goes by, we know that this feedback can become more spurious. It gets harder for users to recall, so we end up with bias there, and it can also possibly lead to more extreme ratings. And what we want is something that accurately reflects the perception of their satisfaction. This is what can make something like an intercept a valuable option, because you can ask for feedback either during or immediately after the user's experience. We often use this at IBM for whatever applications can actually hold the intercept. That way, we're actually asking users while they're trying to do their task. However, that does have a small downside, which is that it's hard to know exactly when to interrupt the user. You can't always know on a website when somebody's done, unless they're like, clicking on purchase or something like that. Sometimes working with a website or web application internally can be a little harder to determine when done has happened. So the downside is you can interrupt the user's task, which may cause them to become frustrated due to this, and occasionally they might even give you a bad score. Because people don't like being interrupted during their flow, it also tends to have a poorer response rate than, say, an email campaign or asking the users once you know they're actually finished. That brings us to like a third context, and that's usability testing. The only thing here is we have to be careful generalizing the results for satisfaction we get from usability tests, because it takes place in an artificial environment, and the sample sizes tend to be extremely small. However, satisfaction can be great metrics for comparisons across user tasks within a design to identify the troublesome aspects within an experience. Now, there are a variety of ways that you can ask satisfaction, from a single question, which can be asked in different ways, to this McDonald's survey, where they're asking about satisfaction on multiple different aspects. Satisfaction can also be used with different scales, though they typically range from 3 points to 11 points, with 5 and 7 being probably the most common. Too few points, and you won't have enough sensitivity. But with too many points, users won't be able to distinguish between the points on the scale. I mean, on a 15-point scale, what's the difference between 14 and 15? They can also vary in the types of labels and anchors. Some only have a numeric scale. Some have only semantic labels, while others have both a mixture of the two. And what about emojis? They've become really popular with feedback. but are they a valid scale to use? In a study by Jay Matlin, they varied text scales with emoji options, and they were found to have equal data quality as evidenced by comparable means and also the same rank orders. So in fact, yes, emojis do work and you can use them. As an example, pre-pandemic, IBM had set up these happy or not terminals. A former colleague that you heard from earlier, Mark Wise, used these in some research to get a quick temperature or happy index. He assessed our Think Desk on-site tech support, the music played in the support setting, and also just general, how is your day going? He was able to get readings based on time of day of week, and the physical location. You can see some of the resulting visualizations that he created from that data. And as far as which method is best to use, well, really the key is just to be consistent, both in your presentation in the scale and the analysis if you want to be able to compare across products, across time, and across experiences. So this means you can't really take, while emojis are fine to use, you can't really take a scale used with emojis and then compare them with a scale that used just numbers or words. So next, once you have your data, how can you analyze it and produce results that are usable and understandable? One way is just to take an average score, simply assign numeric value to each of the scale points, like it's either starting at 0 or 1, and then you average them across all the responses. It's recommended to include the margin of error with the average in your visualization, as is shown here with the error bars. Another method is to use the distribution, and that produces a histogram of scores. In this case, percentages. This can make comparison across time and experiences a little more difficult since it's not just one number, it's actually one bar for each option on your survey question, but it reveals details about the shape of the satisfaction. For example, is it a binomial distribution with the extremes accentuated, with users loving it or hating it? Or is it more in the middle? Or is it more evenly distributed? This can be important data to know for diagnostic purposes and determining how to improve the experience. And of course, there's nothing that says you can't do both. Also, you might look at overall satisfaction. In this case, we defined it as the top 4 ratings on an 11-point scale, with neutral being right in the dead middle. So all the positive things were considered people being satisfied. And in this case, you can see that 86% were satisfied. So really, there's a lot of ways the data can be analyzed, and there's really no standard. For example, the Smart Survey Company divides the actual total value by the maximum possible value, and then multiplies by 100 to get a percentage value they call SAT rate. I've actually included in the speaker notes a link in case you want to understand more about how they actually break that down. So best practices for CSAT and OSAT. 1, be prompt in your timing of asking about satisfaction. The closer to the user's actual experience, the better it is and the better the data will be. Be specific about what you're asking the users to rate, but also consider the context of the other questions you're asking. And in that, try to limit the survey to no more than, like, say, 10 questions. And it's recommended that you use scales with either 5 to 11 choices. Once again, 5 to 7 is often the norm. You definitely want to use anchors at the extremes, but consider using labels for each of the options, though try not to mix and match too much. I mean, it's okay if you have verbal semantic labels on each end and then numeric across, but you wouldn't want to like mix and match that with emojis and things like that. Visual treatments can be helpful, but try to keep it simple so that it doesn't just contribute noise. The most important thing, and I'll say this many times throughout this presentation, is to be consistent, both in your measurement and in how you analyze the data so that you can actually use it to make comparisons in the future. Because otherwise, all you have is one point in time. And what you really want to see is how things go across time or how 2 different applications or products compare. Also allow for comments. Once again, almost all the things that we're going over today, they're not very diagnostic. They give you a snapshot of how your users feel, but you don't really know what to do based on that. So, let's say your satisfaction is low. Well, without comments, how do you know what to change? So comments are key with any of these measures. It's where the real gold mine is for determining the pain points and how you can improve the user experience. And also just be transparent to both your customers and your stakeholders about how you arrived at the numbers. So we said there's not really a lot of consistency, so you can kind of do whatever you want, but do it consistently and be clear about how you did it. But even if you're using best practices, what are we actually measuring, or what should we be measuring? For example, maybe you care about sales. You might want to know how well satisfaction predicts future purchases. According to a study by Curtis et al., satisfaction and repurchase behavior are positively correlated, but it's a weak relationship. And as UX professionals, we actually want to improve the user experience. So Niels conducted a meta-analysis of 298 designs that he tested for usability, and they found a 0.53 correlation between satisfaction ratings and usability measured as subject performance. So users preferred the design with the highest usability, but only about 70% of the time. Kind of like, what? Why would that be? But I know that in my own research conducting usability tests, I frequently watched a participant struggle to complete a task. They make errors, they seek help, but then at the end, they say they were satisfied or even very satisfied with the experience. How can that be? So certainly, in addition to recommending a metric like satisfaction, you would also like to want to have something that's objective, an objective measurement, such as performance when possible, like completion rates or error rates, so that you can tie those two pieces of data together. And next, let's take a look at the pros and cons for CSAT and OSAT. So the pros, it's flexible in format and use. You can use it in almost any circumstance. It's a single question, so it's really easy to administer. It's familiar to people. There's nothing really tricky about the wording. It's just how satisfied are you? And most people understand, at least intrinsically, what satisfaction means to them. And it's really easy to analyze, or it can be. It's as easy or complex as you want to make it. However, it really is a point-in-time measure of the user sentiment. And there can be cultural bias if you aren't careful in the wording, including anchors and labels. And by itself, it's not very diagnostic. You really do need the comments in order to be able to dig down in and figure out how you can improve the user experience. Also, it's very subjective. Satisfaction does not equal performance or usability, and that's really important. And lastly, it's very flexible in how you can use it and analyze it, but it's also non-standard. So it means you can't just say, hey, I've got satisfaction, I can compare it to anybody else's satisfaction. You need to know the details and the context. So, in fact, this lack of standardization is one reason why satisfaction measures have been to some extent replaced by our next measure, the Net Promoter Score, or NPS. And NPS keys off of this idea of your unhappy customers being a great source of learning. But what is it? So in 2003, Fred Reichheld burst onto the scene with the idea that there was one number you needed to grow, which was the Net Promoter Score, NPS. And what it's really meant to do is measure the willingness of customers to recommend a product or service to others, which is interpreted as a measure of engagement or loyalty. And the scale famously ranges from -100 to +100, and there's a lot of guidance about how to interpret it. In the simplest terms, being over 0 is good because it means you have more users who are likely to recommend than not. But of course, it's still like almost a 50-50 shot at that point. And we definitely want to move that needle more into a higher level of recommendation and loyalty. Since marketers and business teams created this, they adopted it pretty quickly. And over time, executives have also fell in love with it pretty quickly because of its great simplicity. It's a single score and it's easy to understand, it's easy to compare, et cetera. And over time, it's become a best practice and has even eventually been adopted by UX research and design. So how do you actually calculate NPS? So step one is assigning the categories, the responses to categories. And there's basically 3 different buckets. I'm sure you're all familiar. On the one end, you have 0 to 6, which are your detractors. On the other end, you have 9 to 10, which are your promoters. And in the middle-ish, you have the 7 to 8s who are considered passive. And actually, they're not even part of the calculation. And we'll get to that in a moment. So step 2, you subtract the percentage of detractors from the percent of promoters, and voila, you have your NPS score. So then the 200-point scale is divided into buckets. And here is an example of a bucket and how those cutoffs are. And it goes from like unacceptable to excellent. And you'll notice that the buckets are not the same size. So what are the uses of NPS? Well, they're used for all sorts of things. Determining compensation for like meeting sales goals and stuff, setting OKRs, objectives and key results, comparing different applications. We do this a lot at IBM. We compare NPS scores. both within domains and across domains. Brand loyalty, which is indeed its original purpose. And finally, it's also been adapted for using to measure user sentiment. But why might NPS be a poor fit for UX research? I mean, based on what we talked about, isn't this the thing that we should be using? But actually, there's some reasons why we might not, which we're going to touch on each one of these items in turn. So number one, is NPS actually applicable for internal apps and sites? The first issue is it requires a recommendation, and recommendation implies choice, or at least opportunity. And for internal applications, a lot of times we don't have choice or even opportunity. It's sort of like, this is the application you'll use for this. So can you really recommend something if there's nothing else and if you're being forced to use something? And honestly, as UX researchers, I think most of us probably care more about satisfaction rather than we do loyalty. The second point, and perhaps in some ways even more troubling, is the wacky math. We'll spend a few minutes on this. So Jared Spool has argued against using this method of calculation because it drives to the extremes. Because remember, we discard those 7s and 8s, which is in and of itself, kind of weird because you are throwing out numbers, which generally statisticians would cringe at that because it's information and it's being lost from the calculation. It's like they don't even count, they don't matter. So it pushes things to the extreme and it sacrifices diagnostic sensitivity to do that. And often using a simple mean typically does a better job at representing the distribution itself. So often we focus on the score, but there's more to it really than the score if you really want to understand your data. As you can see below, each of these 3 response distributions has an NPS of 0, but they're clearly very different distributions when you look at them. The one in the middle kind of has 2 peaks and it's kind of like a bowl. You might have 2-tailed like you do on the right end. So the distribution of your data also matters. So you always want to look at that because you can't just tell it from a score because here they're all the same, but clearly the data is telling you a little bit of a different story with each of these distributions. And next, just to continue this a bit, Spool also argues that NPS in fact hides UX success. And so how is that? Let's say, for example, that you had 50 responses and they were all 0s. Let's hope that never happens, but let's just say for the argument of the hypothetical here that it does. This would give you the lowest score of -100. All right, so you're spurred, you go out, you make huge investments in improving the user experience, and that moves all 50 users from 0 to 6. Wow, that's a huge improvement, right? Well, not according to NPS. According to NPS, you're still at -100. So you've moved users by over half the scale, and yet there's no improvement in NPS. All right, but let's say that these hypothetical 50 users all start out at 8. All right, so by moving from 8, if they're all at 8, your NPS is 0. Just moving 1 point from 8 to 9, suddenly you go from 0 to 100, the max score, which is, basically NPS nirvana. So it's a little strange how the math works. Personally, as a UX designer, I would weep to make such a massive improvement from 0 to 6, and yet NPS detects none of the improvements whatsoever. So it's also diagnostically weak. As UX professionals, we care about what's driving the score, and we care about whether or not the design interventions made a difference. As we can see, just looking purely at the score, it can be very difficult to tell that. And then again, how much of the score is actually attributable to ease of use as opposed to other parts of either the product or the site or whatever. And NPS doesn't really answer those questions. What NPS is good at is giving you an indication of direction of movement and magnitude, and it can tell you about your customer loyalty, but by itself, not why your customers are loyal or how to convert those customers that aren't, how to take them from being passives and detractors to becoming promoters for you. And there's a lot of factors such as cost, performance, familiarity, and features. Ease of use is just one possible explanation. And in the end, you ultimately don't really know what worked. So comment analysis is a must. And it's really dependent on analyzing those comments and trying to find those nuggets. And this can be time consuming and labor intensive. And even if you take shortcuts that are fast and can be helpful, they tend to be a bit on the superficial side. such as identifying simple keywords or user sentiment when compared to doing a full-blown analysis. But in the end, the common analysis could still be problematic. Let's look at another example. Let's say you start with an N of 1,000. So you have 1,000 NPS scores. That's awesome. But it turns out only 20% leave comments. So now you're down to an N of 200. And so in analyzing it, you reveal maybe 6 to 10 categories of various sizes. But with only 200, most of those categories are going to be small. So individually, each of those categories will have a low statistical power, somewhere between probably 6 and 60. So does that 6 or 60 or 5 or 20 or however many users really speak for the entire sample of 1,000 users, much less the full population of users? So it gives you an indication, but there still might be something lacking. And speaking about that, it really is inappropriate for small samples. NPS is very sensitive to the number of responses. And yet you'll also often see it used for conference presentations or usability tests, even though you have a very tiny amount of respondents. At IBM, we conducted an internal study where we sampled groups of 30, 100, 200, and 300 scores. And then we calculated the NPS and the associated margins of error at 95% confidence interval. So the easiest example when you think about this, and when I explain it to people, is let's say your NPS is right at 0. As you see from the graph, the margin of error is plus or minus 26.5 at 95% confidence interval if you only have an N of 30. This means that if we were to run this study multiple times, we'd expect the NPS to be in the range of minus 26.5 to 26.5%, 95% of the time. Okay, but that spans over a quarter of the 200-point scale, which isn't terribly helpful and means you could see wild swings over time within that limit that might freak out your executives, but really could just be attributed to basically noise based on the particular respondents that you happen to gather each time. So what we found is we recommend minimum sample sizes between 150 and 200 responses over whatever period of time. We tend to go by quarters or a rolling 3 months in order to have a chance of reaching an MOE of 12, which is about as high as we'd recommend for the NPS to actually be useful. And because of the nature of margin of error, if the responses are fairly evenly distributed, you need more responses to feel confident in the result, as opposed to if you kind of have one of those groupings on one end or the other end of the scale, then you don't need as many responses. Another thing that we discussed internally was, is 95% confidence interval really even necessary? So those of you who went to graduate school and you took statistics, everything is at 95% or even 99%, right? Confidence interval. And that's when you're doing scientific studies, that makes a lot of sense. But for what we're using the data for, maybe 90% confidence might be good enough. And in that case, it helps to lower how many responses you actually need, which can be helpful if you have lots of small sample sizes. All right, so what construct is really being measured? As we mentioned before, it measures loyalty and it focuses on the extremes. However, an internal study that was done at IBM did find that NPS is highly correlated with satisfaction in a range of R equals 0.75 to R equals 0.85. So it is mathematically a decent proxy for satisfaction. But are loyalty and satisfaction really overlapping constructs? NPS literally asks about making a recommendation, not about satisfaction. For example, if we were to make the following substitutes, does it really mean the same thing? Or do we end up with users just ignoring the wording of the question in order to have it make sense, which has its own issues if your users are interpreting the question differently? So best practices for NPS. First and foremost, no cheating. Don't try to influence your users via color coding or emojis with different faces on them, and etc., because these have been shown to change how users respond. If you are going to do that, you're going to need to do that across the board once you gain consistency so that you're actually comparing similar scales to similar scales. Otherwise, the scales that use these color codings and things often tend to push things even more to the extreme or actually ends up raising your NPS overall. Once again, get comments for all ratings. Sometimes you'll see that people only ask detractors for ratings, but you really want your comments from your passives and promoters in order to be truly informative. Because someone could say, hey, I really love your product, but just like we see in the usability testing, people struggle with stuff, but they still give you a high rating. Once again, that timing is incredibly important. NPS is very sensitive to that. Once again, you want to avoid like some kind of different types of bias, like in just poor memory. So you want that to show up. You can do email campaigns, but you want to do it really soon afterwards, like have something that actually kicks it out, preferably within the same day or so. You're also more likely to get responses that way. So, maybe not useful for infrequently used applications unless you can have that near window impact. And reporting NPS include the survey method, the distribution of the scores, because as we saw, that's really important, and also your margin of error with a 90 to 95% confidence interval, whichever one you choose. Because that will then tell your users what the true range is. And if they see some movement within that over time, people are likely to get less riled up, either positively or negatively. And once again, a minimum of 150 to 200 responses. Pros and cons of NPS. I think we've kind of gone over this, but just quickly. So it's high visibility and commonly accepted by executives. Any measure of satisfaction is better than none, and it is highly correlated with satisfaction. It's a familiar, rapid way for the respondent to provide feedback because NPS has become so ubiquitous, people are accustomed to answering it. It's useful for comparing applications to each other into industry benchmarks, or different implementations of the same application. And it's just a good way to open the conversation between users and the product team. And as we said, loyalty and satisfaction may not be the same construct. It's sensitive to number of responses, non-diagnostic, may not be appropriate for like internal applications or instances where there's no option or no alternative, and the math is still a bit wacky. So then, what is a better fit than NPS for UX research? Are there better metrics that we can use, such as the System Usability Scale, or SUS, which is a foundational scale used by UX practitioners across industries? So what is the SUS? SUS was created in 1986 by John Brooke while he was an employee of Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, which is now part of Hewlett-Packard. It's a UX questionnaire, and it reliably measures perceived usability of systems and products. Once again, it's that word perception, because people are always giving you your perception on things. It's not actual performance. It's a set of 10 attitudinal questions. There's answered using a 5-point bipolar agreement scale, bipolar in that strongly disagrees on one end and strongly agrees on the other. It yields a single score ranging from 0 to 100, and it has an associated letter grade. The average SUS score ranges from 65 to 70 or around a C, which is what average would be in American schools. It would be on the A, B, C, D, F grading scale. It was also once known as the quick and dirty usability scale. We'll get back to that in a minute. Now it's actually over time become a standard. It's been research vetted, heavily cited, commonly used, and benchmarked. So once again, let's step back for a second. What is the definition of usability? So within 10 years of creating the SUS, John Brooke also chaired the group that created the ISO 9241-11 guidance on usability. And this was huge for us. It makes usability a necessity. It's a requirement, not just a nice to have. So let's get into what the actual SUS is. So here is the SUS Classic alternating tone, and we'll get to why it's called Classic in a moment. So basically the idea is there are 10 questions, and they alternate between positively phrased and negatively phrased. They did that on purpose. They did a lot of research on it, but as we'll see in a moment, there are trade-offs in using the alternating tone approach. Because of those trade-offs, because research showed that by alternating the tone, users often made mistakes in interpreting the questions correctly, and sometimes researchers made mistakes in the calculation when they were back doing it manually. So another scale was created using only positive statements, and these have also been vetted, so it's okay to use the all positive version in lieu of the alternating tone. Really quickly, how do you calculate a SUS score? And we'll look at the alternating tone because it's a little more difficult, but just to kind of go through it, thank God there are calculators available now, so you don't have to do this by hand and possibly mess it up. But basically, you take each of your questions. For the odd numbered positive questions, you subtract -1, which is in the response. See the response and then the deviation. For the even numbered negative questions, you subtract 5. What this does is converts all the responses. They are on the same 0 to 4 scale, with 4 being the most positive. So then you add up the converted responses as shown in the SUS column, and you multiply the sum or total, in this case 33, and you multiply it by 2.5 to create a SUS score, which yields 82.5. And once again, that scale goes from 0 to 100. And then as another step, when you have multiple people who've responded to these, you actually, take the total for all the respondents and divide by the number of users. Based on research by Sarro and Lewis, the SUS can actually also be translated into letter grades, which can be helpful for communicating results to stakeholders if they're familiar with this type of grading system that we use in the US. It allows you to compare applications or trends for an application across time. As with NPS, if you want to compare a trend to score, calculate and report the margin of error at either the 90 or 95% confidence level, be consistent. And if you're reporting multiple metrics, use the same confidence interval. Once again, the margin of error tells you how many percentage points your results will differ from the real population value. For example, the 95% confidence interval with a 4% margin of error means that your score will be within 4 percentage points of the real population 95% of the time. What does the SUS research tell us? The SUS has been well vetted by many researchers and practitioners. It's been cited in thousands of articles. Just a few kind of things that have been done here, just to highlight the SUS scores align with other qualitative usability ratings. There was a couple of research projects done by Banger et al. In order to validate that. Number two, there were indeed studies shown, at least 3, that there were problems with the alternating tone, and that's what led to the creation of the all positive option. A couple of studies were done to calculate mean scores, to create benchmarks to show that you can compare SUS scores across industries, which can be really important. Number 4, we're confident in the tool's reliability and in estimating the sample size needed. You get reliable, which means repeatable results with only 12 to 14 users, which is fantastic. As you saw with NPS, you need a lot more. And like NPS, the research by Sarro shows that SUS can predict revenue growth. So it sounds like it might be a pretty decent replacement, right? I mean, you can ask the, so let's just look at the best practices. You can ask the level of experience with the tool. It's really important to do that because as we know, the more experience you get with the tool, usually your ratings are going to go higher because you've adjusted to it mentally. And so you want to make sure and take the level of experience into consideration because it can count for some differences you see in data. It's also best to administer it electronically, especially for scoring purposes. It also allows you to randomize the order of the questions and to make it, as I said, easier to score. Consider telling your users that they're both positive and negative statements to help avoid misunderstanding the questions if you choose to use the alternating tone. Personally, I just tend to use the positive only since it has the same types of reliability and validity. Make sure that you use the name of the system or product and the question. And as said earlier, calculate and report the margin of error. So quickly, the pros and cons for SUS. I mean, it sounds pretty great. It's an industry standard, benchmarking, reliable, valid. It's perfect as a follow-up to any evaluative UX research, provides you with an overall usability score and additional information on expected future use, training, support, all of that. So what about the cons? It's not really the best choice for longer surveys. If you already have a bunch of questions in your survey, adding a single question with 10 options could actually mean that people don't end up completing the survey. Also, the calculation is a bit more complex than, say, OSAT or NPS. If you're using the alternating tone, you run the risk of user error in understanding the question tone. And once again, it's still not diagnostic. We still haven't got there yet. You still need comments. So 10 questions, whew, it's a good metric that's reliable and it's highly prevalent, it's valid, but wow, 10 questions. Is there any way that we can measure usability more efficiently than the SUS scale? So enter stage left, the usability metric for user experience, and also UMX Lite. I mean, SUS is great, but are we measuring usability in the most efficient way possible? So let's talk quickly again about the SUS problem. So at this point, it's not really dirty because we've done so many studies and it's been shown to be reliable and valid. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, though, it's not really so quick. I mean, 10 questions, not quick. Often the SUS is not asked in isolation, but with other questions such as demographics. So adding that one metric with 10 questions can take up a lot of real estate. The SUS is also supposed to be a unidimensional measure of usability. That it takes 10 questions to assess the single dimension of usability is not terribly efficient. So the goal of UMUX was to reduce the number of questions to get at the same construct of usability as the SUS. So the usability metric for user experience, or UMUX, was developed by Finstad in 2010. He started out looking at each of the SUS 10 items correlations with overall SUS and found that the item I thought the system was easy to use had the highest correlation. So eureka, we can get rid of 9 questions and just have one single question. However, with additional research, the finding was inconsistent. So he decided to start over again and went back to the International Standard Organization ISO definition of usability as inspiration for selecting items. And as we saw earlier, it's the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. So effectiveness is the accuracy and completeness with which specified users can achieve specified goals. Efficiency is the resources expended. And satisfaction is, that acceptedness or that perception that the system is working for you the way you want it to. So Finstad used these 3 components to guide the selection of candidate items in his developing metric. For each of the 3 categories, he developed 4 candidate questions or items in addition to the one he initially had high confidence in. So he kept this system is easy to use. So taking effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, he used the highest correlated item in each category, plus that ease of use item from the SUS to create his metric UMUX. Here is the UMUX, and you can see the direct mapping between each of the 4 categories, effectiveness, satisfaction, overall, and efficiency, with the questions. Note that half of the items are worded in a positive tone and half the items are worded in a negative tone. He also used a 7-point scale instead of the 5-point scale we used in SUS, but he found a high correlations between UMUX and SUS. So UMUX does appear to be a good proxy for SUS and eliminated the number of items to rate from 10 to 4. Pretty huge improvement. However, there are some criticisms. UMUX may not actually be unidimensional. There may be multiple factors that it's measuring, which kind of throws a monkey wrench into this notion of UMUX being a good replacement for SUS. And 10 items to 4 items is a meaningful drop for sure, but it's still the best we can do. So then, a factor analysis was done by Lewis, Utesh, and Mayer on the UMUX, which showed 2 factors that were highly correlated with the TAM. And I feel like I missed a slide. A second. Yes, all right, there we go. So in 2013, a former colleague, Brian Utesh, was receiving some executive pressure to increase the response rate from external clients. As you might imagine, people don't want to answer a lot of questions on a survey. I know I don't. So in order to try to reduce the cognitive overload with regard to the number of questions being asked, Brian and his colleagues worked to try to reduce the SUS even further. They looked at the technology acceptance model, or TAM, that came out of marketing research, and it predicts the tech acceptance. And what it looks at is usefulness plus ease of use is used to predict tech acceptance. So then, after they did a factor analysis on the UMUX, it showed 2 factors that were highly correlated with the TAM. Factor 1 was positively toned items, and factor 2 were negatively toned items. Factor 1 was chosen as the one used in UMUX Lite, as it corresponded closely with perceived usefulness and the perceived ease of use that they found in the TAM. Slide. So now UMUX has been cut down to 2 questions using the same 7-point scale as UMUX. There's a really high correlation with SUS and UMUX Lite, R equals 0.85, and even a higher correlation with MPS of R equals 0.88. Lewis and Saro have also done additional research to try to make the wording of the requirements question even simpler. So the first was replacing capabilities with functionality and requirements with needs to end up with products functionality meets my needs. And across 3 studies, they found no significant differences between the means of the original and alternate UMUX Lite scores, and no significant differences in the distributions of the response options. As part of their ongoing research to further simplify the wording of the item, they simplified it even further. They replaced functionality with features. So in the end, you end up with the system's easy to use and this system's features meet my needs. Once again, in research, they saw no significant difference between the original and the simplified UMUX Lite scores. So why does this matter? One, shorter words tend to be easier to read. And that leads to number two, which can be helpful for non-native speakers to understand. Within IBM, often our surveys go out in English regardless of who they go to, with an understanding that most IBMers have a basic level of English speaking. But no matter what, being able to simplify what you're asking people, the more clear it is and the more simplified, the more likely you're actually to get a response that's consistent across people's understandings. So, all right, we can see the progression from 10 items in the SES to 4 items in UMUX to just 2 items in UMUX Lite. And UMUX Lite is a simple calculation to correspond to get on that same 100-point scale, and it maps to the SES norms. And it's way less onerous on our users. Also, something to mention is that I've never seen anybody give feedback like I have with MPS, which is like, why are you asking me this question? You know, it's not relevant. I don't have a choice, blah, blah, blah. Those 2 questions I've never seen that kind of feedback on, because people know whether or not they think something's easy to use, or if it meets or if the features meet what they need. So the best practices for UMUX Lite, use the name of the system or product in the question, such as iPhone. And once again, calculate that and report the margin of error. And I should have put on here also, once again, comments. Comments are your best friend to go along with all of these metrics. Let's start with the cons this time. It's relatively new, and that's really the only con. So what we've seen happen is people have run it concurrently with the SUS in order to be able to compare the two. At IBM, as part of the VOTE program, we actually run it concurrently with MPS, and we've seen that same high level of correlation. And have been yet to see a study that's thrown cold water on using UMUX Lite. So, in addition to the pros of SUS that we had, this is short, simple to administer. It's consistent with another metric, the TAM. It leverages those SUS norms, diverse applicability, independent validation, and an expandable framework. So, for example, if you did want to add additional items from the SUS, you could do that. You wouldn't want to use it in the calculation of UMUX Lite, but it could give you additional data if there's one of those particular questions that you want to mine deeper into. So it's important to recognize where the metrics we've discussed fit within a larger framework, and that includes both attitudinal and behavioral metrics. One such framework created by researchers at Google is HEART. That includes both attitudinal and behavioral metrics. One component of the framework is the attitudinal piece around happiness, the H in heart, which I've pretty much exclusively covered in today's presentation. We've only looked at attitudinal. But as we also talked about, sometimes the attitudinal and behavioral don't match up. So in order to see how everything fits into a larger context, it's important to take into account behavioral metrics for engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. Task success is one of the things that we also use in the VOTE program. In addition to asking NPS and UMUX Lite, we ask what their main goal was for the day and whether or not they were able to actually complete it. And if not, why not? The behavioral metrics help us understand if users can actually do what they're trying to do, not just their perceptions of how they're doing. And it's a more balanced way to uncover insights that will impact the user experience and look at what people say and what they do. All right, then. So in summary, when do you use each of these? So just kind of a quick rule of thumb for these. If you just want a finger in the air, kind of gauge of use perception, OSAT is perfectly fine. As we said, it's very flexible, it's adaptable, it's a single question, it's not intrusive, people understand it. So that's fine. If you're interested in customer loyalty, and I do say customer and loyalty, or when your execs just want a single measure of something, MPS is absolutely fine to use. If you're interested in usability and want to have additional insights, and if your users are patient enough to actually complete it, SUS is a fantastic measurement. However, if you want something that gets at usability that's more efficient, then we come down to UMUX Lite. And there's really no reason to use UMUX over UMUX Lite that we've seen. So when you don't have the screen real estate for more items, you want to keep it simple and short, ask UMUX Lite. And last but not least, I'd like to recognize some of my colleagues who presented a version of this talk at UXPA last year and who were foundational to the slides that I used today. And that's all.
Wow. That was great. Debbie, we do have a question before I get to some of my questions. But Payel asks, Is SUS used following only usability tests? I am wondering regarding the calculation of confidence interval and margin of error in a moderated usability test where sample size is often small. In an unmoderated usability test, I can see that the sample size will help with statistics. Yes, of course.
Well, SUS doesn't have to be used only after usability testing. It's just a really good metric to use as part of usability testing. If you think your users will answer it all, the different types of questions also give you insights into different areas. I wouldn't say diagnostic, but it does cover more than say just UMUX or, you know, the Holy Grail NPS 1 question. The other thing that we mentioned about SUS is that you do need fewer users. So you still probably want to calculate the margin of error, because margin of error is just always good to know. It lets you know how realistic of an expectation it is to generalize that data. And even though, as we all know with usability tests, there's limited generalization anyway, it's just kind of good to know what your margin of error is. Did that answer that? There were several questions there. I'm not sure I got them all.
Yeah. Oh, sure, thanks. You're right. Oh. I do have a question.
All right.
About Net Promoter Score. My organization where I work is very fond of the NPS.
Mine too.
But the scale, you know, and it's interesting what you mentioned about the investment to go to 0 to 6 and still wind up with a negative 100. That's tough. But is +1 enough on an NPS scale? An organization brand is +1 enough, or is bigger better? Is it the higher the NPS? You know, is that the goal? A higher NPS? And as a piggyback on that question, have you ever seen an organization with a perfect +100?
So to answer number one, try to bring it back up in the presentation. We tend to do it on almost like kind of like a gas gauge, right? Where you go from poor, which goes up to, you know, around like, what is it, -25 or something? I don't even remember what the scale is, but yes, definitely better is better here. Bigger is better. Okay. So +1 just means that, I mean, think about it. 0 basically means that you have as many detractors as you do promoters. And if all you want to be is average, then okay. But most companies I know don't want just average. You know, they don't want to have as many haters as they do lovers. They want to be able to push that gauge more, push the needle on the gauge. So yes, definitely what we shoot for, what we end up doing is we take a look at where an application is right now. And then we set a target for them to try to improve across a year, right? So we set that like in the first quarter, and then they have like the entire year to try to meet that. And that's based on, you know, getting NPS every quarter, every month, you know, all the time continuously, and taking a look at their comments that hopefully then are feeding into an improvement cycle that you can see over time with the NPS. You know, definitely if you have an NPS up in the 40s or something like that, you're actually doing really well. So the scale is definitely tilted towards like, you know, poor goes poor, 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 poor. And it's kind of like, oh, you're okay. And then yay, good. And then woo.
Gangbusters.
I've actually seen people with NPS over 100, which just lets you know that they calculated it wrong. But I think I've seen one of 100, and basically I question that. It's like, did you have everybody who works on your application go out and test it? Was it test data? But I have seen some fairly high ones, like in the 70s and 80s. So it is possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you. Come on, there must be more questions.
Oh, no, it's Mark. No, I'm leaving now. Mark's going to ask.
I mean, she didn't talk about it, but, you know, the other thing with NPS is there's a lot of people try to game the system by, because the magic of NPS is that people aren't supposed to know how it's calculated. So they answer honestly, and it falls into these buckets. But then, you know, certainly you see all the time people that put on an NPS type question and they try to direct you like, oh, 9 and 10 is good, 7 and 8, and then not that, right? So they try to direct the person there. And so, you know, the ability to use that as a way to directly compare products or applications or changes over time. Depends on them using the scale correctly.
Right. And that's one of the reasons with the VOTE program, we do that, right? We use the scale, this exact same questions, the exact same scale, presented the exact same way across every application. So truly, we're trying to take a snapshot of the same metric at different points using the exact same questionnaire and the same scale, so that hopefully we are comparing apples to apples. And I think, Mark, was it your research or Annette's research that showed that trying to game the system actually does make your NPS go higher? But the thing is, once again, is that really usability? Is that really, are your users really satisfied? Or have you just sort of guilted them subconsciously into giving you a better score?
It's just the classic people looking to the metric as the thing they're trying to change,
Yes.
rather than improving the interface that will then be reflected in a change in the metric.
That's the thing. If you make good products, if you have a good service, people are going to want to use it, and they're going to give you word of mouth. And so trying to game the system, it might give you some kind of short-term, I guess thing, but it's not real. And I'd be interested to know if people still give out the same kind of loyalty and the same kind of recommendations when they've been subconsciously gamed as they do when they give a realistic assessment of how they feel about it.
All right, other questions? All right, so let's thank our presenters and wish them well. And it was very, very interesting. I hope folks have a lot of good takeaways here to improve our work and our careers and our industry. And certainly this has been very career enhancing, and I've learned a couple of new things. System usability scale, that's new, and UMEX, I'm going to take them back to my organization, see where we go with them. I'm going to urge them to do some A/B testing on this new website that we've got rolling out, and we'll see how all of that goes. And card sorting certainly for our upcoming dashboard revisions with our CSAT data. That'll be all very helpful. So is there anything else? I know that folks are saying thank you in the chat box. And so let me just share the screen one final time. Okay, just to note, once again, New York APOR's upcoming events next week, next Tuesday, is a roundtable discussion with the folks making the election night calls at Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. It's an all-star lineup. Title of the event is The Decision Desk, followed by our Young Public Opinion Scholars competition. If you don't know anybody in the New York metropolitan area, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they are eligible to participate in this event. Have them communicate with New York APOR, and we will send them information on how to submit an abstract for consideration, and it is a $1,000 prize. Following in mid-June, our Meet the Masters event. I feel like inviting today's panel to that. And then the upcoming towards the end of late June, New York's annual awards presentations. Again, finally, any additional comments or anything that folks would like to say? All right, then I wish everyone a nice afternoon. Be safe, be well. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, Mark.
See you.
Thank you, Jason.